Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. Just before we start, brothers and sisters, I just wanted to make an announcement of Brother Ata'ul, who some of you may know from the BJJ classes that happened with Nurul over here. I understand, I've been told that he suffered a bleed on the brain, and following the CT scan they were going to operate, but after a second scan they decided not to. They moved him into ICU to monitor him. Please keep him and his family in your prayers. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant him shafa and to give him full recovery and health. Allahumma ameen. Okay, so today's event with Dr. Asim Qureshi, and for those of you who don't know, we're brothers, right?
I deny it.
Yes. I was thinking about Dili Hussein's podcast, which is Blood Brothers, although he's never had a blood brother on that podcast, so we picked Dili to it, I suppose. Right?
No, he co-hosts it with his brother. That's the whole point.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, okay. Especially the early ones.
Alright, okay. I'm just trying to find my notes, sorry. So, Ustad Nasser decided to invite Asim down to really talk about activism for Palestine. It's been a month, brothers and sisters, and the situation seems to be going from bad to worse and now to devastating. We've got now over 9,000 deaths in Gaza. As far as I know, the latest news reported is that Netanyahu is resisting and objecting to a ceasefire, and we don't know when this will be. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to relieve our brothers and sisters from their difficulty and from this challenging situation that they're in, and to give them ease and freedom from the oppressors, from the occupation, and we ask Allah to deliver it as quickly and as swiftly as He can. Amen. So naturally, people want to know what to do, right? There's a lot going on at the moment. There have been several demonstrations and have been growing by Allah's grace larger and larger. I think the last reported was about 500,000 people turned up, although no surprise, BBC reported it as tens of thousands, right? And I think tomorrow they're aiming for 1 million, aren't they?
No. Next, the following Saturday, 11th November, inshallah.
Right? But other than that, I think people have questions, and so we're going to take some questions from the floor. I think there's a mic that's going to be going around. But I thought what I'd do is I'd start with some questions that I had about activism. And I wanted to start more broadly because I think it's a good opportunity to speak to Asim, who has been doing this now for many years. And when I say many, it's because I don't know how many now, right? I've lost count of how many years that is. And it's important because sometimes we can just focus on the one issue, right? But then many problems that the Ummah is facing. And activism has always been important, and not just now, not just in the last month. So it's important to take a wider look at the idea of activism and what it means to the Muslim community. And then we will, inshallah, probably focus and hone in a little bit more on the subject of Palestine. I'm sure people have got questions for him on that, right? So I want to kick off the discussion by asking what activism means to you.
Okay. Jazakallah khair. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair. It's nice to know that Ustad Nasser invited me and not my own brother. But okay, we move. Alhamdulillah. What does activism mean? So this is an interesting one because people will often say to me things like, Jazakallah khair for doing the work that you do. as if it's something that's unique or it's something special. And I always find that, you know, my instinct is to feel very, very reticent about accepting any kind of thanks or praise in that way, because my fundamental feeling about the work that I do is that I've been privileged to be in a position where I'm able to attempt to help people as a full-time job. Not everybody gets that privilege. Do I feel in any way that I'm special somehow, that there aren't dozens, hundreds of other people who are capable of doing what I do? I know for a fact that there are, because I meet these people and they're very smart, very intelligent, they're capable of doing, you know, maybe much more than I can, but I've been given this privilege and this honor. So what happens when we talk about activism often is that we engage in this, kind of notion of like religious secularism. So there is a space where you are religious, which is you go to the masjid, you pray in the masjid, or you read Quran, or you do any of these things, and that is your religion. And then you do all this other stuff, which is political, but that's outside of the stuff that you were doing that's religious. And for me, there's never been a distinction between these two spaces. If I'm doing something to do with my activism, it's because I'm trying to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I don't make a distinction between that and my salah. Like for me, there's no distinction between them. And you know, we can go into so many different kind of evidences for this, you know, but the key one that I often think about, subhanAllah, is that the Prophet ﷺ, he is performing tawaf, right? So he's in Mecca, he's performing tawaf, he's going around the Kaaba, and he stops and he looks at the Kaaba and he starts speaking to it. And he says to the Kaaba, "Oh, how beautiful you are. But know this," and he's saying this to the Kaaba directly, "that not you, nor the environs that surround you are worth the blood of a Muslim." So what the Prophet ﷺ is doing here is that he's helping us to understand that there is a hierarchy, right? Now the Kaaba, if you said to most Muslims around the world, the Zionists are about to destroy the Kaaba, right? What are you going to do, brother? There would be complete bedlam on the earth. You would literally have people walking across borders. You would have young people taking up arms. You would have absolute chaos in order to protect the Kaaba, right? Like if you asked anybody, they would say, "I would put my life on the line to protect this building." But the Prophet ﷺ told us that this building is not worth the blood of a single Muslim. So what does that tell us about how we understand our priorities as Muslims? It tells us that we have become ritualistic Muslims. Muslims who want to carry out the rituals of Islam, but haven't actually internalized what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking from us. And so if the Prophet ﷺ is telling you something, but you're saying, "Yeah, I know, but that's hard, but performing Umrah is much easier," then it's something that we then have to ask ourselves. And so it's a roundabout way of answering a question, which is, for me, activism is simply practicing the deen completely. If you're a Muslim who takes the deen seriously, there should be no separate space. You should not be thinking along the lines of me signing this petition, me attending this demonstration, me tweeting this about Muslims who are suffering, me liking this post or whatever. That all of these things, they might seem insubstantial, but they are all acts of what? Of worship. Jazakallah khair. Okay, that's all they are if you have the intention to make them that. Now, if your intention is just like, "Oh, politically I disagree with this," without any connection of your heart to its deeper meaning, then you're actually losing out. We're losing out on the benefit that we could get from turning what is this activism into ibadah itself. And so, I mean, for me, it's a little bit of a different way of thinking about it.
I know you're not saying it, right?
Yeah.
And I know because we have this discussions all the time, right? Like, what you're not saying is, only when we see the blood of a Muslim being spilt in the world, does that require or necessitate some form of action. For example, we're in this country and then we believe Now, whether it's the political process or the economics of this country, they're severely hurting people, right? There's no Muslim ostensibly dying. There's no one with blood, right? There's no sort of oppressor or, colonizer or anyone sort of standing over their head, right? Let's not get into that. Okay. Right? So then, is that okay? I mean...
What do you mean, is that okay?
In the sense that there's no one dying. I just wanted to be more explicit.
Oh, right. Like here in the UK, there's no reason. Well, I mean, So in light of your sort of discussion on activism, because I'm trying to draw out from you what activism means, and you've talked about it at the moment in terms of the sanctity of the blood of the Muslimin. Right.
Right. What does it mean to a believer to be involved in activism more broadly than that?
So, one of the greatest tricks that the shaitan ever pulled was convincing us that somehow the borders that exist, that structurally, geographically, from a citizenship perspective, from a legal perspective, that separate us from one another, that they somehow mean something. It's really interesting. I did a research project almost a decade ago now, subhanAllah, where I went around the world for a legal team interviewing Muslim scholars. And, I'd ask them a very, very simple question. You are on one side of the border, say for example, I know I'd give different examples, but say for example, you're one side of Pakistan. And on the other side of the border is Afghanistan, right? There is no physical barrier between you. You just know that this line here, like just draw a line in the sand, that's the actual border between the two countries. So you're standing there, and on the other side, you're seeing a brother getting beaten up, or a woman getting raped, or whatever, and this is happening right in front of your eyes. As a Muslim, what do you do in that situation, right? And to a person, I interviewed Shia scholars, Sunni scholars from the whole range, Deobandis, Sufis, Salafis, Ikhwan, everybody, right? And some senior people as well in all these traditions. They all said, you have to step across. You have to step across and stop this from happening. But I'm like, but there's the border right there. Like legally, the border stops you from crossing. You do not have citizenship in that country. But they're like, yeah, but you can just step across. I'm like, okay, but there is a border. They're like, no, but you can just step across and do it, right? And they were very, very firm upon this. Okay, I was like, all right, let's expand this. There's like a whole series of like 17 questions that I was asking them. And they kept making the situation more complex. I was like, okay, well, what if there was a fence in front of you, but it's jumpable, right? They would like, no, but even if it's jumpable, just jump the fence, right? For them, when you ask them the question based on a scenario that's very, very, very easy and very simple, it was a case of, well, obviously, the natural justice of Islam, the ethics of the Quran require that you make that jump, that you cross that border. And then you start applying it wider, right? Then you start saying, well, what happens if like a country comes and invades this place? Then they start getting jittery, right? Because now they don't know how to answer the question. What was at a micro level, what was very obvious to them is now no longer obvious, because they're like, oh, well, okay, no, well, we don't know what to do in this situation now. Because they've never been asked to think like this. And actually, subhanAllah, there were only like 2 or 3 of them who said the same thing to me. No one's ever asked us these questions before, right? Because they had never thought to even question the legal regime that they live in. And so you asked about the UK, and again, I'm giving you a convoluted answer because there are a whole series of underlying assumptions that we have about the world that we live in, right? And one of the main underlying assumptions is that the jurisdiction that we live in is the be-all and end-all of what we can do. And that we should never have even a desire to change that material fact. The fact that I live here, the fact that legally I am separated inside my mind from the vast majority of the ummah, which exist outside of Western Europe, right? That somehow I don't hold responsibilities to them, like actual direct responsibilities, by virtue of the fact that I am not close by to them. And we can like talk about like maybe the Fard al-Kifaya later, but there are actual obligations that emerge.
So on that point, on obligations, right? I mean, you have, activism isn't something new, right? We see it all the time. I mean, if you talk about activism, you imagine someone with ripped jeans and a Che Guevara t-shirt or something like that, and wearing a bandana. I don't know, right? It conjures up a particular image, and activism is being done all the time by actually non-Muslims. And lots and lots and lots of non-Muslims. In fact, all of the scenes on TV that you'd find, whether it's the Occupy movement or the, or any other movement that you see, right? Mostly it's non-Muslims doing it. What fundamentally is the difference between sort of broad activism and Islamic activism? Is there a difference between the two? Is there something that we need to be aware of? Are there parameters that we need to be aware of? Is there something particular to being...
I think there are parameters, and I think Dawood Wali does a very decent job in his book on sacred activism of, kind of helping us to understand that there are contours to what we should and shouldn't do in the course of trying to find justice on this earth. Nobody's asking anybody to kind of like, wave pride banners or whatever else in the course of this activism that we're doing. But again, like, it comes back to this thing that, what is it that we're actually talking about? Why are we talking about activism as if it's this entirely separate space? Like, if you're somebody who goes to the masjid, you should be thinking about Palestine. And just there's a brother who's in prison in Egypt, Ala Abdul Fattah. He's been in prison for quite some time now. The Sisi regime imprisoned him after the Rabaa protests in 2013. And he's been a British political prisoner, so he's a British national, and he's been detained there for many years now. He writes this beautiful essay. It's called "Palestine is Always on My Mind," right? So he's this prisoner in Egypt, okay, and he's writing about the fact that no matter what situation that he is in, even inside the prison, the one thing that is always on his mind is Palestine, right? And mashallah, he's a practicing brother, he's one of our brothers, alhamdulillah, but he's never forgotten it. And what you learn from these people is, especially political prisoners, is that they have this level of solidarity, that they're always thinking about the ummah at all times, right? Because when you speak to them, they say, well, this is just our obligation. It's the minimum that we can do. Even though we're in prison, we need to be making dua for these people. We have to do whatever we can. If we can write letters from prison in order to support them and encourage others to support what's going on, then we're going to do it. And so, again, this is, I think, one of the key things that I came to do, inshallah, which is tonight, which is to try and remind us that when we think about the world, what we're not doing is thinking about it as a separate space to anything else in our life. We're not saying that, oh, this is something that's different to what I normally do. We have to incorporate the idea that the needs of the ummah are part of our obligation, because, brothers, the reality is that the resources that you have, and sisters, actually forget about the brothers, the sisters that live in the West have more rizq than 95% of Muslim men in the ummah, right? Just think about that. Think about all of the Muslims in Indonesia, in Egypt, in Sudan, across the African continent, across the subcontinent, Southeast Asia, right? Our women have more rizq, more provision, whether it's intellectually, whether it's economically, whether it's through their access to the media, access to politicians. So now, when we ask ourselves, right, if the ummah has responsibilities towards an injustice that is taking place with the Rohingya, with the Uyghur, with Palestinians, who is more culpable first? A Somali fisherman or a Muslim woman living in the West? Who has the higher burden before Allah's eyes out of these two people? I would argue, personally, that the Muslim woman in the West has more obligations and more burdens on her than the vast majority of Muslim men.
Just thinking about, I just want to close off on Islamic activism and ask about the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He says that whoever amongst you, and from my own reading, it's anyone from the Muslim community sees an evil, then that he should change it with his hand. If he is unable to, then he should speak against it with his tongue, and if he is unable to, then he should hate it in his heart. What do you think that hadith, what do you think the Prophet ﷺ is trying to say to the Muslim community in terms of what we're talking about here, activism?
Yeah, I think this hadith is amazing, subhanAllah. You can take so much from it. You can literally have an entire talk just on this hadith and nothing else. You know, again, talking about hierarchies, the Prophet ﷺ is establishing a hierarchy of behavior here for us, right? The lowest of that behavior is hating something in your heart. Maybe you don't have the capacity in terms of you're locked up as a prisoner and you see an injustice taking place, you hear about it on the other side of the world. You have no ability to do anything other than hate that thing in your heart. Maybe you have fear. You don't feel like you're able to speak up or to change this thing with your hand. But don't think that hating that thing in your heart is not a positive action, because the Prophet ﷺ is telling us himself, it's a positive action, it's an action of the heart. The problem is when we forget to hate things in our heart. And when you stay at that lowest level all the time, apathy sets in, because it becomes too easy to downgrade from hating things in your heart to just being like blasé and apathetic about them, because you're not actively involved, because it becomes too normal, because the injustice becomes too normal in your life. And you know what's interesting is one of the exercises that I do sometimes with young imams when they finish their training in Al-Azhar and Medina is I ask them, what are the big issues that Muslims are dealing with? And they say all the usual stuff, like here in the UK, prevent, they talk about securitization, the war on terror, LGBTQ, all of this, that and the other, right? They say all of this stuff. And then I ask them all at the end, I say, go into your wallets and take out your debit and credit card. So they do, and I said, everybody hold it up. I said, every single one of you has one. I said, not a single one of you mentioned that there is no greater system of injustice that exists in the world than the system of finance that we are forced to engage with on a daily basis. The problem is that we forget to hate that in our heart. So if you want an example of how apathy can set into our hearts, there is no better example than a system of fiat currency in the world. A system that is so unjust, that it literally oppresses people in the billions every single day. And yet we don't hate that in our hearts because it's just so normal. Well, what else are we going to do? Okay, fine. You might not be able to change it, but at the very minimum, don't forget to hate it, right?
This leads on to the next question, and I think that this is something that, there can be a sense of being part of something or a movement, right, and getting sort of really riled up and getting angry and getting animated and sort of going out there and sort of baring your teeth.
Yeah.
But how much do you actually know about it? How important is, because you're saying that apathy sets in, but actually before that there's education, because you may not know about it. How important is education in any of these conflicts? Because I'm not going to do it here, but I'm sure if I asked people when the Balfour Agreement was, if I asked them when the Nakba was, if I asked them various questions, I only know about it because Ahmed and I have been doing some stuff together. So I can do that now. But if I were to, I'm sure that many people here wouldn't know the details, right? They feel the sense of the broad injustice. How important is it, do you think, that Muslims should be educating themselves as part of their activism? How important is education?
I mean, it's crucial if you're going to play an active role, especially if you're going to play an active role. I think it's crucial anyway, because the more knowledge you have, the better equipped you are to understand that thing and to then, kind of raise your own rank accordingly. Like you'll feel like you want to get more involved. So it's something that will help you. But, the thing with, that having that education, of course, it carries a burden as well, which is then you do have to act upon it, okay? So if you are in the workplace and you are online and social media, right, and you do feel strong enough to type something, then at some point you're going to get resistance to that thing. And when that resistance comes, how do you respond to it? Do you simply just say whatever's in your mind because you feel like, oh, I need to defend this issue. But then you say the wrong thing, and what happens is that it becomes like a weak point to get discredited on.
But the argument is actually that some people are going online, and for example, and I've seen it, this sort of saying, if you believe that this is a problem, anyway, I believe it's a problem, saying, Jews are filthy, Jews are this, Jews are that.
Sure.
Right?
Right.
So for me, that's partly coming from a position of ignorance. Lots of fervour, lots of excitement,
yeah,
but a position of ignorance.
Look, there's a lot of rage. I mean, look, I'm not here to control and manage people's anger, right? If I'm very honest, I feel rageful every single day. Every single time a new video pops up, I feel extremely rageful, to the extent that some days I just literally want to put my fist through a wall. That's how I feel about what I see. The fact that I have the ability to try and do things to help change that does help me, helps me manage that. Some people are not, they don't necessarily feel like they have the resources to be able to do that, and so that expresses itself in angry ways. It expresses itself in ways that might end up becoming detrimental to them. When you live in systems of injustice, you have to accept that part of the course of business is that the way that you are treated is inherently unfair. Do not go into these arenas thinking that somehow you are entering into a level playing field. The playing field is not level at all, brothers and sisters. It is sharply skewed against us. And so when you enter into it and and all of a sudden you feel, oh my God, I can't believe they attacked me for saying this. I can't believe they're such hypocrites for saying that. Ya akhi, what the heck do you think was going to happen? The system itself has been rigged in order to achieve that result. What you thought you were going to say words and that you weren't going to be held accountable for them, or that the system itself wasn't going to come at you. And this is the thing, right? Getting involved in this type of work, it comes with a cost. But I'm here to convince you, inshallah, that that cost is worth paying. And here's why. Because we always win if you stay the course. And what I mean by that is, you put out a tweet out there. That's true, it's factual, all the rest of it, right? And you get hammered by lots of different people on social media. Every single character that somebody types to criticize you, every single person who reads that online, this is a tahara for you. So you are winning always. You have never lost in this situation. It is the easiest exchange you could possibly make. I speak the truth, I get criticized for that truth, I win. It is a simple equation, right? And if we actually understand that just by virtue of some nutter who hates Islam, he criticizes you, he has a huge following, all of a sudden millions of people are looking at that tweet. And you're the only one who's benefiting in the end. And it's because capitalism teaches us that we have to be able to measure things in terms of whether or not they're successful. The Quran does not give us that message at all. The Quran gives us the opposite message, that you could materially lose in life, but a heart that's filled with a love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and with conviction in what you believe, that heart that dies, that heart that loses, is the one that's successful in the end. It's a consistent message throughout the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never says, when all the armies gather, when all the Muslims get together and they have enough numbers, then they will overwhelm their enemies. It doesn't happen. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never says this in the Quran. The calculus at its most is that when there's double of them than you will still be granted victory, providing you remain true. Right? So we're always told that we will be operating in a situation of what? Of being in a weaker position. Because this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests us. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests the truth of our convictions. And so when brothers go online and they're not very well educated, you will be held accountable for the things that you say. But here's the worst thing, you'll be held accountable by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala thinks of you. And that's why the education is so important. It's important for you, because forget about it harming the cause and harming whatever, right? It harms you to put something out there that's incorrect, that is based on factual inaccuracies or lies or whatever, right? That's why we should always check the kind of videos that we're sharing. You know, was this really from this time period, or was it from some time period 10 years ago, all right? Like, you know, it's so important always to do that fact checking.
Okay, I think what we're going to do is we're going to come on to the actual Palestine issue, but just before that, I want to clear up a question that, you know, sort of seems to come, you know, back and forth all the time. You know, Allah says in the Quran, you know, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ, right? Let there arise amongst you a group of people who are doing something, right? So, and I've heard it, right, which is why I'm saying it, right? The idea that because Cage are doing something, or or men are doing something, and whatever, right? Then the responsibility has been lifted from me, and I don't need to do anything.
Right.
Right. I hear that a fair bit. So, what do you think about that type of approach?
Right.
About your personal responsibility, because they're doing it actually. I don't need to do it.
Right. So, with any type of issue that requires a collective response from the Muslimin, right? Imam Malik, he actually describes this in the Muwatta. I think he's the first person to formulate it as well. He describes a town that's being attacked. And he talks about the town itself having the first line of responsibility to repel the attack. And then he presents this idea of these concentric circles that surround the town. So if they're not able to repel the attack, then it becomes obligatory upon those who are closest to come to the aid of that town. It goes from being something that's a collective responsibility to the closest, then it becomes an individual responsibility then. So what moves from the fard al-kifaya to the fard al-ayn, right? So the individual responsibility. You must go there and you must assist and you must end this matter. So that the thing, whatever it is, it has to be completed, right? So fard al-kifaya is an obligation that rests on the whole community until that thing is completed. So for example, the janazah, right? It's a sin for the community not to complete the janazah. But if a portion of the community does it, okay, just a few people, they do it, that lifts the responsibility of everyone. But until those people do it, that responsibility is still there and the sin is still there. And it's the same with oppressed people as well. Until their oppression is lifted, the sin of their oppression hangs over us like an executioner's blade, right? That is the best way that I can describe it. That we're all potentially culpable until that matter is resolved. The matter has to be resolved for us to actually feel safe from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment. Now, the question is, back in those old times, it would be those who were physically closest, the Muslims who were physically closest. But we know now, with globalization, with the formation of nation states, with passports and whatever, that it's easier for British Muslims, for American Muslims, to travel to, say, for example, Syria or Libya or Palestine or wherever, than it is for, say, somebody from Egypt. Much closer geographically. But because of the political situations in their countries, they don't necessarily have that same ability. But it's not just about travel, it's also about money, it's also about speaking, it's also about resources. What resources do we have? What resources do they have? Okay? So my argument is that when it comes to this idea of the fard al-kifaya, of fulfilling an obligation, that Muslims in the West have a much higher burden because of the resources that we have than almost anyone else in the Muslim world. That execution is a blade that I spoke about, it's going to strike our necks before it strikes anyone else, because it's not easy for Egyptians to travel. It's not easy for Libyans to travel and whoever else, right? They have much more repressive regimes that they live under. And so what about us? Where does that leave us then in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's eyes when He reconstructed the world in this way where we have these weird senses of freedom that other people don't?
I think we're going to come back to this point about sort of individual responsibility a little bit later. What I want to do is to move on to Palestine. I'm sure there's going to be questions from the floor that brothers want to ask as well. I want to ask something very particular because, and you know, forgive me for those who had to endure my khutbah today, but I think it's something that I've been thinking about increasingly, right? The issue of Palestine was only just a little bit younger than our dad, right?
Yes.
And we're now old enough to have lived through moments of brutality that the Palestinians have faced, right? I mean, they're facing it all the time, right? But, you know, in the way, probably not in the way that it's happened now, but it's happened through subsequent, successive events, right? Since Arafat decided to engage in diplomacy and the PLO decided to engage in diplomacy, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the countries, when they got together, one of their mandates was to try and help Palestine. Let's use the word help Palestine. The PLO, up to this point, have been largely unsuccessful in their endeavors, right? They've given every single concession possible, right, as a way of moving towards a two-state solution, something that not all Palestinians are behind anyway, right? So the PLO are saying, look, we understand that you have your, that this is what international law is dictating. We understand where the borders are. We're going to accept Israel as a state and a two-state solution. But it's never reciprocated. The illegal settlements haven't stopped to this day. The UN is virtually powerless. The US vetoes it all the time, right? So the PLO hasn't made any progress. The OIC similarly has lodged, you know, complaint upon complaint upon complaint to the United Nations. Over 50 plus years, all of these Muslim countries who have got together, who said that we're going to help the Palestinians, haven't been able to make dent. Let's be honest. The situation of the Palestinians has progressively become worse. In our country here, we have been advocating for and reaching out to politicians, you know, and I'm quoting a word, imploring politicians to step in and help the bloodshed, step in and stop a ceasefire, step in and do something for the Palestinians, right? Not just the government, because you might say actually Muslims have always believed that Labour is a friend, maybe misguidedly, but they believe that, right? The Tories were always, you know, the nasty party. Labour were going to be supporting just causes, and now we find all of a sudden that Labour councillors are defecting from their positions in Blackburn and other places because they're talking, and one tweet that I got, Angela Rayner was sat down and they said, our words fell on deaf ears. And rather than calling for the ceasefire, at the least, everyone seems to be closing ranks in the political process. So my question is, do you think that we can have faith in the process? And do you think that we have to be patient, as the PLO have been, until we get the result that we want?
Yeah, this is a really complicated question for many reasons. I actually met Yasser Arafat in 2004 at his Maqata in Ramallah when I travelled around the West Bank, as you know, for a couple of weeks. And yeah, it was an interesting meeting. I was highly uninspired by him. He, by this stage in his life, and it was near the end of his life, he'd become this arch pragmatist who had lost any sense of an imagination for what Palestine might be. And, you know, having spent that time period traveling around, and it was really interesting for me because I traveled like the north, you know, kind of horizontally across Palestine, vertically. And it was interesting when you got to places like Jenin, how different the imagination of what a Palestine might look like was from being amongst like more political class PLO people in Ramallah. There was a huge dissonance between their respective positions, right? And so the question is really for us, right, more so than really what they're doing. They're going to do what they're doing, and we should try and support them as always in best as we can for the decisions that they're making. They have their own ulama, they have their own leaders who are helping to forge a pathway for them. And of course, they're the ones who are taking all the risks, right? It's somewhat easy for us to pontificate from over here when they're the ones who are bodies on the ground. It makes it much harder. And of course, they've lost leaders along the way as well. Of course, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin being the most, important of them in many regards. Now, for us, I think there's two aspects of this. One, the one is that one I've just spoken about, which is to try and support them in the decisions that they make. But the other one is always one, and we've touched on this already, which is this idea of imagination. The imagination that we have lost because we became pragmatists in everything that we do. I always ask people a question, like, hatta al-yawm al-qiyamah, right? Up until the day of judgment, is this it? Is this capitalist world, with all of its injustice and the way that it's organized, according to these nation-state boundaries, is this what you believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended as justice for the world, as the final end, what the world looks like before the end of time comes? Or is this an unjust system that requires change? Now, nearly every single person I've ever spoken to about this says, no, this can't be the end point. So the next question is, okay, where is the imagination then to hope for something different, for hope for something better? So while I do say that we have to support the Palestinians in the kinds of decisions that they make, okay, and the Palestinian Authority is not the organization we put that trust in, because they are prison wardens for the Palestinian people. The PA is not anything other than an extension of the Zionist force, right? And that's what Palestinians themselves believe about it, which is why you see massive unrest in the West Bank in particular. Of course, they have no real say in Gaza whatsoever. But I'm talking about us here. And Palestine it's the most important example of a much wider problem. The reason why we focus on Palestine so much is because there is no other issue in this entire ummah that has the collective response that Palestine does. Nothing. There is no other issue. You can't point me to another issue where Muslims are in as much agreement across all sectarian lines, across the orthodox and the heterodox, right? That they agree that this is an issue of the ummah, nothing else. And so because of that, it's magnified in its importance. But it's no actually more important really than Syria. It's no more important than the Rohingya, but it carries this thing about it. So with that comes this imagination that we should have, which is based on one simple thing, I say. What is Israel? Israel is a settler, colonial, apartheid, racist regime. For us, forget about everything else. Forget about the religion. Just think about it from the perspective of natural justice, right? What your brain and your fitrah teaches you about justice, right? Is it ever okay for us to say that a state that has these qualities, that it should exist in the 21st century? And the answer has to be emphatically no. And so when people ask you about, well, what about Israel's right to exist? The immediate response should be, which Israel? Are you talking about a settler colonial apartheid Israel? The same type of regime that South Africans who had been through apartheid said, that is more apartheid than what we went through. They suffered through apartheid and they say Israel's worse than what we went through. So to normalize Israel is to say that in the 21st century, that it is okay for an oppressive state like Israel to exist. And forget about the religion. just from a common sense, natural justice perspective, if you asked a child who had just learned about what discrimination looks like, they would be able to tell you, no, that looks wrong to me. From their fitra, they would know intrinsically that Israel, in the way that it is, should not exist. And all the groups are very, very much committed to this idea that if it didn't exist in that form, they would find a solution to work alongside everyone. Because Islam has never had this anti-Semitism in its history. Anti-Semitism is a product of the European Enlightenment. The Enlightenment philosophy that they love and lionize so greatly, right, is rooted in the ideology of these hierarchies of races that they developed themselves, and which they carried out these massacres across Eastern and Western Europe. This is a problem of their making, that they've placed at our door. It is not a problem of our making. And what we would never do is to accept that just because somebody has been unjustly dealt with, that somehow we should pick up the burden of that and allow for another people to be oppressed.
Yeah, I mean, Jews were living in Palestine well before, in peace and in happiness, so there's already a prior example of that. I just want to, you didn't answer the question actually,
okay,
fully, right?
Sure.
So the question was more about the engagement of the hope. There's a hope that by engaging in the political process, that the people who we consider to be our representatives,
yeah,
in Parliament, that they're going to do something that's going to change the whole issue of Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know that I bear no stock. I place no stock whatsoever in the political process in this country. Both Labour and Conservative parties are kind of very, very, very much kind of Zionist entities. They support Zionism completely as a political project, as a state, have never criticized it in terms of its colonial apartheid ideology, except for Corbyn, of course, right? Corbyn has his own problems as well that he had in relation to certain issues to do with Syria and the Uyghur, right? If we put that aside for a moment, he was the only one who really called this out. Now, who do we turn to? We say that, okay, let's look at the Muslim politicians within this group. What are they about? The most progressive, in inverted commas, the most radical of them all, Zara Sultana, probably out of the whole group of them, took a very long time to issue a response. But the key is that even though Zara Sultana has more progressive politics, more left-wing politics, let's use that term instead, she's still part of Keir Starmer's institution. There is still an upper threshold to what she can possibly do and possibly say, because the leader of her party has a very, very strict line on these issues. So is it possible for Zara Sultana to say, you know, openly and aggressively that my party is supporting an apartheid settler colonial state? Maybe she might get away with it a few times, but it will never become Labour Party policy, right? And so where does that leave us? Because we could say, all right, Muslims should vote in bloc for the Greens, but we have a system that is somewhat different in the UK. We can't vote as a bloc because it just depends on where we live. So you might say Tower Hamlets could achieve something special in terms of really shifting the dial on a candidate, but how many constituencies could we possibly do that in? Maybe 5, 6 perhaps at the very most, maybe more. Okay, but the point is that the Muslim vote is too spread across too many constituencies.
Are we clinging onto false hope here, or is the idea of unity politically in the way that we're constantly reminded by various Muslim leaders who are pushing us and sort of saying, this is the answer, this is how we're going to win, this is how we're going to make movement. Do you think that that's really going to happen?
No. And I think the only way they will make changes when they feel hurt, like actually hurt by our actions. And I think we can do that much more economically than we could ever do it through the vote. I think if you start hurting businesses through boycott campaigns, if you start disrupting in different ways through civil disobedience, that has much more of effect. And we've historically seen as well, it has much more effect. Now, when we look at the stages in which, kind of social justice movements, whether it was apartheid or the civil rights movement in the US and many others, right? The moment where things change is the moment that people are willing to start sacrificing their own freedoms based on the principles that they have. And I'm not even talking about violence here, because actually violence, what violence does is that it turns those people who feel sympathetic towards your cause away from you. Okay, Che Guevara actually talks about this very eloquently in many of his books, right? That terrorism as a tactic in the West, okay, in particular, doesn't have the effect that you hope it might. Because what happens is that, the average person who is maybe a bit unsure about what these issues are about because they haven't really studied it, it turns you completely against them. It turns them completely against you. What targeted civil disobedience does is that it lets the public know that there are all sorts of problems taking place, providing you don't hurt their daily lives. So what you're supposed to target, and this is what groups like Palestine Action do, and I really recommend you follow their work, is that they will shut down arms companies like Elbit Systems. By what? By spray painting them, by chaining themselves across the road, and whatever else. They get arrested for it because they're maybe doing damage to property, or they're disrupting a highway or whatever, but they're not disrupting a main road, they're not disrupting a motorway, like, say, for example, Extinction Rebellion do, right? The environmental rights group. So what happens with Extinction Rebellion? They can never really produce a groundswell of opinion in their favor because they have caused too much chaos on the roads. So what we have to do, in my view, is build a politics amongst Muslims that is not limited to representation politics. I'm not saying don't engage at all in representation politics. Okay, it is a means. If a means opens up to you to talk about these issues, you have to take that regardless. So if an MP is saying that I want to hear about what you're saying, then you should go and talk to them. And if an MP is taking a stance against Palestine, like Steve Reed, whatever his name is around here, and having his fundraisers shut down, right? That's exactly the kind of thing that we should be doing. We should be letting them know. Okay, but we also now need to start maturing as a community, like the Black Civil Rights Movement did. Maturing to the extent that we're able to say, in a coordinated way, we're able to understand that here is a weakness in their system and their structure, and we're going to disrupt that, even if it means that a few of us will be arrested in the process of it. Okay? That kind of civil disobedience, what it does is that it allows us to let them know that this is a serious issue, but we will make your life difficult enough that your bottom line will be affected. That the weapons that you want to sell will all of a sudden have a glare on them that before they didn't. So Lockheed Martin and Elbit Systems are trying to sell arms to Israel. The world is watching now. And subhanAllah, I've met so many of these activists. There's one girl who works in Cage, actually, Zoe. These people are amazing. They're literally willing to put their lives on the line in terms of being arrested and being sent away for taking very, very ethical stance against Israel. And what's amazing is that when they finally get to court after they've been arrested and charged, is that when they finally say, hey, look, these are the reasons why we did this, this is what Israel's doing, that quite often when juries hear that evidence, they release them. And that's one of the amazing things, right? That people are more fair-minded than we sometimes give them credit for. Yes, they have all of this media rhetoric, okay, that gives them a baseline of racism. The society is fed a baseline of racism from politicians to the media to whoever, right? So they have that baseline because the Sun and the Daily Mail are the two most read newspapers in the country. But actually, when you actually sit down and talk to them, and there's that whole thing, not you, us, you're all right, it's them other packies, right? Like, because why do they say that? Because they probably know you in a certain circumstance, right? They know you to a certain degree, and so they're like, oh, this guy's okay because I've actually seen the whites of his eyes and I know what he's about. And you'll find that a lot of people are like that. That it's very easy to push past the small prejudices that they have because they've been built up on a diet of prejudice. But actually, because of that natural fitri fair-mindedness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in most people, you're able to pierce that fairly easily once you actually sit down and talk to them. And that's what a lot of these activists end up doing. They use the court as a mechanism of changing people's hearts. And yeah, sometimes they do get convicted, but surprising how many times they don't.
But, and this is my last question. These individuals like Zoe and others, right,
Yeah.
when they go and sort of glue themselves to the floor or
Right.
cause a problem, they're actually part of an organization.
Mm-hmm.
They're part of an organization that has a legal team, that has people who will prep them and tell them everything that they need to know, what their rights are, all of this sort of stuff's going on. And I don't know how well they're funded, but they have some funding as well. Do you think that the Ummah has enough togetherness? Do you see that we have enough unity to be able to come together and strategically act in that way? Or is there much to work on?
Which is why I don't call for it. I'm talking to you guys here right now about it theoretically, right? We're here to discuss ideas with one another, inshallah, and hopefully the Q&A will bring out more of that. We're still, as a community, relatively in our infancy in terms of mobilizing and serious mobilizing. But like the Black Civil Rights struggle, it took a long time to convince people to take certain actions. Many of you will know about Rosa Parks. Hands up if you've heard Rosa Parks' name before. So many of you, right? Now, here's the thing about Rosa Parks. People believe that Rosa Parks was tired one day and she decided to sit down on a bus, right? She was an old lady, old black lady. She was tired. She just wanted a seat on the bus, and the only seat that was available was in the white section of the bus. So in Alabama, at that time, if you were a black person, you had to sit at the back of the bus. And the only seat available to her was at the front. This is nonsense. This is not how this story happens whatsoever. They planned specifically for Rosa Parks to sit down in the white section. It was an elderly black civil rights activist. She had been an activist for decades before this, right? She'd been part of the Christian church, Baptist church, and very much believed in civil rights. They'd actually done it twice before, but the two people they had done previously, they had some questions about their character, which is why they never took it further. But Rosa Parks, when they finally organized for her to do it, they carried it through. Now, what did it take? When they organized the bus boycott, the plan was already in action. She was going to get arrested. They knew she was going to get arrested. She does get arrested. And so they call the bus boycott. Okay, so they're all boycotting these buses, but how are they getting around? They're getting around because the few dozens and dozens of cars that there are, those guys say, we have cars, we will take you wherever you need to go. So if you're a laborer, we're going to make sure you get to where you need to go. If you're working in a restaurant, we're going to make sure you get there and you get back. It took the entire community to make sure that everyone was still able to get on with their daily lives by sharing these cars. And of course, there were lots of white people as well, by the way, who were helping with transporting people around. That's why the bus company's bottom line got hit. It got hit hard. And so they were forced to change their policies about the way that the buses worked. Okay, because of the sacrifice that was involved, because of the careful planning that was involved. And we, unfortunately, we have two problems. We haven't mobilized to have that civil rights movement, and we also haven't internalized in our hearts that struggling for our rights is something worth sacrificing our liberty for. Those are the two things that are requirements to do this type of activism. Because do not be fooled for one moment. The vast majority of the faces that I see here are melanated, okay? You are not indigenous. You are from Ireland, okay? You can still be removed, all right? There is a separate set of laws that determines that at the arbitrary whim of the Home Secretary, without having to give any court process beforehand, your citizenship could be taken away just because you historically hail from another country. Not even that you have citizenship of that country, just the mere fact that you may originally have some historical right to another citizenship elsewhere. And here's why this is a problem. It's a double standard because it can never be applied to somebody who's indigenously white to the UK, which means what? It means in the UK, we have a two-tier system. And I could evidence the two-tier system in 1,000 other ways based on like 23 years of doing this work, right? But this is the most egregious one. Why? Because it tells us that actually, legally, we don't actually belong in the way that our white counterparts belong. Because we could be subject to a system of laws that removes us. It means that there's two systems, one for them and one for us. And we have to be aware of that. And if we're okay with that, that is a problem in itself because it means that we don't even have enough izzah for ourselves that we can say about us as a community that we should defend our own honor, that we have that even that sense of dignity, self-dignity that we should want to fight for these rights. Like how despicable a situation is it that they're literally telling us through the law that we think that you are less than us, and we're saying, but it's not really affecting me right now, so like why should I even care? But it does affect you because it could potentially affect you, or it could potentially affect your children or your grandchildren. And that's how they've always done things with the law, that they encroach bit by bit by bit by bit. They're not going to reverse this law. So the question is, where are they going to take it to next? And that's always the biggest concern.
I think there will be people who have questions, I'm sure there will be, about what to do further. I mean, we've talked broadly about activism and some of the parameters of what it means to be activists in the country, I suppose, some of the challenges that we face, right? I have more questions here, but I want to open up to the floor and let people ask questions. We can start with Zakaria. Can I ask people, to avoid asking questions like, is it halal to go to a demo, please? Yeah. Something else would be preferable, yeah.
It is.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
So my question has to do with like the government suppression. So recently, what the Met Police have started doing is they're taking pictures of random protesters, marches, and posting them and putting them up for as wanted. This happened to my brother actually.
Okay, I understand.
So I was just wondering, like, how can this be avoided? What precautionary measures we can take to somehow like circumnavigate it, or get like caught in these legal troubles, basically.
Jazakallah khair. One of my favorite videos that's come out of Gaza right now is of a young man with a scarf wrapped around his head giving a TV interview, and his mother comes along and she rips the scarf off his face, right, and tells him off, right, for not having enough bravery to show his face when he's speaking his words, right? It's one of my favorite videos that I've seen coming out of it. Like, there are these moments of like just amazing, like, wow. Look, I'm not saying that we don't live in an oppressive and repressive society, but we have to put things into perspective, right? Which is, what time are we living in right now? And what is our connection to, what is going on elsewhere in the world? Yes, we should be a little bit sensible about how we express our rage, how we express ourselves. We don't want to make ourselves easy targets, for sure. Hamas is a proscribed terrorist organization, which is a political maneuver by the British government in order to stop any kind of moral, financial, political support for the group, right? So it's a terrorist organization. So we talk about the Palestinian resistance instead, okay? We talk about their rights to defend themselves. We don't talk about Hamas, specifically, because it is a proscribed terrorist organization. It would be illegal for us to promote them or lionize them in any way. So you have to be a little bit sensible. Don't make yourself an easy target. But also just, I'm not going to sit here and mollycoddle anyone, right? I'm going to say to you, have some sense of izzah for yourself and for what other people are going through. We're seeing literally parents trying to dig their children out from under rubble, right? And if the police are taking photos of us, we should give them a nice picture with the big smiles, so then when it's finally used on the TV, they've got a smiling face instead of one that's scowling, right? There's actually a former prisoner who taught me that trick, you know, like don't ever let them catch you not smiling, because otherwise you look like this, like, you know, guy who's, you know, enemy number one. It's much more harder for them to demonize you when you've got a big smile going across your face. Yes, be sensible. Don't make yourself an easy target by sloganeering out of rage things that are illegal, okay? But also have some sense of self-honor, that whatever the police are doing here and whatever else, I'm not doing anything illegal. But I'm going to proclaim my rights to say what I need to say to help those people as forcefully as I can say it, right? So unfortunately, my advice to you is man up.
Can I ask if people, so we've seen videos, and I think someone asked this question privately on the message. If people are being approached at their doorstep by police for having a Palestinian flag up or some other Palestinian sign, and they get accosted at their door, they've done nothing wrong, right? What should they say to the police there?
They should say to the police, ask them, am I being arrested? If the police say no, they say, then please kindly leave. Stay polite, but the police have no right whatsoever to ask you any question unless you are being arrested. If they say you are being arrested, then you do not say anything either. You wait until you get to the police station, you ask for your lawyer, and you wait for your lawyer to help you speak to the police, okay? You never speak to the police by yourself, ever. It is a very, 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 very simple principle. If they ever stop you in the street and start asking you questions, you say, sorry, I'm not answering your questions. Okay? There's
been a few videos circulating of police at the door and the guy is holding his camera and having like a back and forth with them. You know, and I felt like, why is he even talking with them?
Right. So the brother's mentioning the fact that there's been a few videos of people talking to the police at their door, right? You don't have to engage with them at all. And my recommendation always is to say that, you know, don't ever talk to the police unless you're being arrested. There is nothing that you gain from the exchange. What you choose to hang outside of your window, you know, providing it's not like Hamas's banner, right? Which of course would then be constituted as a criminal offense, but they wouldn't even ask you a question in that situation. They would literally just come into your house and say you're arrested for hanging this outside. But the Palestine flag is not that. It is not a criminal offense. In fact, more of us should be hanging Palestine flags outside our homes in order to normalize the fact that this is something that's good to do. This is something that's normal to do. Very proud of Norbury High Street, where all the shops, there was literally a parade. You know, so Jazakumullah khair to the brothers who organized that and did that. It's such an amazing, I posted on Twitter, I was so proud to see that the high street that I grew up in, streets that I've gone up and down like thousands and thousands of times, is literally a parade of Palestinian flags, right? And for those of you who are worried about like supporting nationalism because of the Palestinian flag and whatever else, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. You'll survive, inshallah, okay? It's not about the nation state. It's about the Palestine flag being a symbol for their resistance.
Next question, please, Ahmed.
The two-state solution that's been bandied about since 1967 has never been something that Israel has engaged in seriously, and one of the main reasons for that is because they know that they don't have to. They know that they will always have impunity in the way they act because they have the military and financial and diplomatic support of America. You are talking about impacting the bottom line, and that's when people change. So effectively, there's two ways that changes, because that is the very reason why they've never come to the table, because they know they don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two ways that this could possibly change. One, that there's a major rupture in terms of international politics that causes, I don't know, a shift in the balance of power in the world that causes, that whole configuration to change.
Yeah.
The second one, that seems unlikely. The second one is that America no longer sees Israel as a politically useful tool for them, to put it in a crude way. So surely our strategizing should be around making it that way. Surely that's the only way to actually bring about change. Anything else is really futile, because as long as America sees them as a useful ally to have, then they will always be able to act with impunity. So do you agree with that sentiment, firstly? And secondly, if you do agree with that, what are the ways we can actually cause the Israel issue to become less of, you understand what I'm getting at? How do we actually move the situation such that, Norman Finkelstein, for example, speaks about how the American jury has shifted over the last 20 years to become less inclined towards Israel because of the brutality of the regime. So there's a shift going along, but we as Muslims surely should be trying to push that further down the line with the force of numbers, with what we are able to actually do to make Israel something that isn't a beneficial endeavor for the American empire.
Ahmed, you answered your own question. Like, Jazakallah khair, that's exactly spot on, right? And this is about how we have seen the shift in goodwill towards the Palestinians, right? We know, even if we don't have the data to prove it, all of us can see it. We can see it on the streets. We can see it in conversations. We intrinsically know that there has been a massive shift. And I think part of the reason for that is because they do not have a monopoly on the information war anymore. Before, in the past, Fox News, The Telegraph, The Times, New York Times, The Washington Post would dictate everything about this conflict because there was no way of verifying any of the information that was coming out. Now we literally have Gazans who have nothing, who literally have nothing, with the rudimentary smartphones that they have, acting as citizen journalists for us every single day. And this actually really started with Operation Cast Lid, right? That's where it started. Remember, like, how much of a shift there was then because they were videoing, and obviously smartphones weren't as good in those days as they are now. So I think it's been a decade now, right? Since more than a decade now, right? And so, the technology has shifted. We are now seeing directly, you can see the outpouring of support, which they are obviously worried about. And I think that this is one of the big changes. What's really interesting is that Israel, a much more sophisticated society in many regards, where are the endless streams of, human videos of all of these atrocities that the Palestinian resistance are supposed to have committed, right? Like, you would have imagined that if you're seeing something on one side, and by the way, 1,500 people is a lot of people, okay? In a space of like 2-3 days to kill that many people, we're talking about mass casualties. We need to start taking some of our own ethics from the Quran very seriously, which is, in Surah Hujurat, we are told that if an evildoer brings you a piece of information, that you have to verify it. Israel isn't just an evildoer, it is a pathological liar. Can I say that fully, without any problem whatsoever? Like, you just have to look at the way that they covered up the killing and murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera journalist, to see exactly how they go about their business. But they've done it from the very beginning with this. But how has that changed? How have the stories of the beheadings changed? It's changed because of smartphones. Because people were like, okay, sure, right? we're willing to give you a bit of latitude because you've come out and said like 40 babies were beheaded, but now's the time to show us the evidence. So they were given that goodwill initially by the world's media, who ran with their narrative. But unfortunately, when they run with the narrative, everyone accepts it. But slowly you see all these videos of all these people who are like, oh, well, okay, so I was willing to like side with Israel initially, but they're not showing us anything. They're not showing us any evidence. So I think actually, before anything else, the shift that's happening because of technology, because of the way that now we're absorbing information, has been probably the most significant thing that's helped to change the dynamics of this whole thing. What that's also done though, is that it's emboldened Muslims, I believe, in a way that they've never felt emboldened before. So people who I would criticize heavily in the past have now felt emboldened to hold like the Democrats in the US, you know, talking about what's happening in activism in the US, and even over here with the Labour Party to account, saying like, what the hell is going on here? Like, are you guys serious? Right? You're talking about this as if all of this is normal, but it's not. And so that shift that you were talking about, even the kind of like the Allah engineered shift, I actually think that's happening too. That what we're seeing right now is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reconfiguring the world in a way that will allow the Palestinian cause to now exponentially increase in its ascendancy. And by the way, the longer this conflict goes on, the worse Israel looks. I know we want a ceasefire because we want to save lives, right? But we also have to accept the fact that the longer it goes on, the worse it is for Israel. And I would never be somebody who would say, you know, oh, you know, sacrifice Palestinian lives for the sake of the larger cause. Of course, we should never want harm upon anybody. But Israel is losing the information war every single day. And we can see the shift in just 3 weeks, almost a month alone. It's a massive, like if you go from 7th of October until now and you look at the types of shifts in perceptions, it's massive. And so I think that there are moments to be hopeful. I think what it does tell us is that your average person, not the institutions and structures of power, your average person is somebody that can be appealed to.
Yeah, we've got 10 minutes. Yeah, we've got another question. While it goes over there, I just want to say, before I came here, I got a call from Brother Maqbool Javed. He was telling me, he was saying exactly the same thing. Sami Hamidi said the same thing when he gave the talk at Hidayah. Brother Maqbool was saying that he was talking to a non-Muslim woman who burst into tears and she said, I can't take it anymore. She said, I just can't take, she's not a Muslim. I can't take seeing babies day after day, I can't take this anymore. Something needs to happen. So the information war, not just for the Muslims, but for non-Muslims as well, they're deeply feeling that this is completely unjust. And so I think that information war must be, that's something that we can do evidently as part of the activism. It should continue. Brother Rizwan.
Just want to thank Dr. Asim for taking the time to talk to us today. I'm sure we will benefit greatly from your insights, and inshallah we will benefit more the more we put our attention on this issue.
Inshallah.
I want to sort of ask a sort of hypothetical question and ask you to speculate a little bit. We've seen that the Yahud have doubled down, you know, like in the last few days especially today. Allah musta'in. Despite the fact that they're losing the narrative, right? So the speculation is this: if you think that Netanyahu's got like this last chance to cement his legacy, he's not going to let it go with this tremendous support he has from the US, the UK and the EU. I don't know if it's verified yet, but I'm sure Biden has just in secret agreed to a $10 billion package for
14 billion. Yeah.
So, as you said, we all want a ceasefire today, now. Today, right now, right? everyone has to come to the protest tomorrow, regardless of whatever you think about whatever is going on. Get out and pray with your feet. And as you say, like, the longer there is no ceasefire, the worse they look. But has it not been clear from day one that ethnic cleansing or genocide is the goal here? Either they push them into Sinai somehow, who knows how that's possible, because not one of them is going to willingly leave. Well, it's a bit so, with the full backing of the world, with the apathy and the sleeping giant that is the Muslim Ummah, you know, how do we secure our hearts for the days ahead? That's my question. Can get our heads off the chopping block.
You know, yeah, securing our hearts, you know, subhanAllah, it involves a few different things. One is, you know, bearing witness to what's happening and feeling connected to them, because they're the ones who are suffering. But it's also through the Quran and through dhikr. You know, these things are all interconnected. So as I said, that like activism is not separate, you know, part of the religion, but, you know, the spiritual parts are connected to the activism too. We need both to work in tandem with one another. So the more you contemplate and reflect on the Quran, the more dhikr you make, the more you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's aid, you know, the more it helps in terms of making sense of what's going on. And especially when, you know, constantly remind ourselves that this isn't the life. And also when we remind ourselves that the Gazans themselves see themselves as winning even in loss. That's why, you know, some, you know, kind of white colleagues of mine have always asked me why in very difficult situations Muslims say Alhamdulillah. They don't understand it. Like, why is the natural reaction to praise God in this moment? It's because we have a different schema for how we understand, you know, winning and losing. They don't have that, which is why they don't understand how the Gazans can at the same time be praising Allah while they're losing. And so, you know, Quran, dhikr.
You said earlier, sorry, stay the course and you will win.
Yeah, of course. I mean, regardless of the outcome, you win. Regardless of the outcome, you win. And that's the whole point about this religion. This religion places no burden on you being materially successful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never says to us, I will not let you enter into Jannah until you are, you know, until you have ended oppression. He just wants us to do our bit. That's it. And it makes it very easy in that respect.
Just get some quick questions in, Asim.
Very briefly, I'll just make some comment on what you said. So, I mean, the first thing is, as soon as this happened, the narrative they kept pushing, they keep pushing, is this is our 9/11.
Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
And you know, there seems to be a playbook. Every journalist, they're repeating the same narrative again and again. So I was thinking, just following up from your point, that as people have commented, you know, the Palestinians are showing us what's happened to them, whereas the Israelis are telling us there's no evidence for what's happened to them. You know, much like, I think, you know, there's a lot to be said for the fact that they're calling it the 9/11, because it's actually a similar playbook all over again. But my question is more this. Now, there's a political angle to all of this, but then recently you hear some of what Netanyahu's saying, and him and the people with him. It's this whole messianic kind of narrative they're also pushing, and they've said it openly, you know, that this is the start of them awaiting their Messiah. You know, from the Islamic perspective, you know, that's quite scary, because you know, for us that means that the biggest fitna that we've been warned as Muslims, the fitna of the Dajjal, is getting ever closer. So that's something, you know, I just like your kind of thoughts on. You know, that's another perspective that I think we just have to prepare ourselves for as well.
Yeah, no, Jazakallah khair. You know, I think the thing about the end of times coming is that the Sahaba themselves were constantly worried about it, to the extent that they thought that the Dajjal was going to jump out of the trees and get them, right? That's like how worried they were at that time, that they were close to the end of times. And for us, that's something that we should be thinking about as well, but only from the perspective of ensuring that our hearts are ready for that moment. Like, we cannot control time. We can't stop Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan for how history will unravel when He decides to make the big changes in the world that will allow for those moments to come. But the question we have to constantly ask ourselves, am I personally ready for that moment? Have I memorized the first 10 ayat of Surah Kahf, for example? Right? Like, is this something that I have done? Something that I have been told explicitly will help me for those days? Have I ensured that I have done that thing and I'm ready with that thing? And there are many other ayat and things that we can do in order to prepare our hearts for that moment. And so you can only do what you can do to prepare for something like that. Whether or not they are messianic in their approach, and I would question the extent to which Israelis are actually religious, right? Like, I don't see it as a religious society. Zionism is an ideology in and of itself that is disparate from Judaism, right? We have to understand that Zionism is an ideology that produces an ethno-nationalist state, and that is everything that is focused towards. There's nothing to do with Judaism as such. Judaism is a mask, it's a veneer for what's actually going on within that country. And so whether or not they believe it or whatever, it's got nothing to do with us actually. And whether the evangelical Christians believe in their Armageddon or whatever, really it's got nothing to do with the things that we need to do, which is to try and demobilize them as best as we can and prepare our own hearts and ourselves, inshallah.
So I've just got time for one more. Any other questions? Or should I ask one?
Assalamu alaikum for the information. Just a very quick question, and what is being asked for lack of my knowledge. What can we do to wake up the Middle Eastern countries, because we look forward, we have to see if they're doing anything, and in this case they don't seem to be, well, they're helping definitely, but not as we would like them to, and what can we do?
Jazakallah khair. That's a really great question. So we always separate the people from the governments. So the people, their hearts are alive to this issue. The people want Palestinians to have justice, for the whole world, in fact, to have justice. Egyptians want it, Jordanians want it, they all want it. What we have in most of our Muslim countries, whether it's Pakistan or it's Egypt or it's Jordan or Lebanon or whatever, are ostensibly mukhabarat states. They're like intelligence states. They are states that are ruled by the military or the national kind of security establishment of those countries. It's very, very difficult when you live in such oppressive structures to effectively do anything that goes against your own those interests that they have. And those interests are directly connected to US hegemony. Their currencies are often linked to the dollar. The kind of aid that they receive, especially if you look at Egypt, for example, the aid that Egypt receives is ridiculous from the US, right? And so when all of those structures are made like that, for the average person to actually express what they truly feel is very, very difficult. But we saw it after the 7th of October, which is why some people say that the reason why the Palestinian resistance did what they did was because they knew that their time was coming to an end in terms of their ability to manage Gaza carefully and properly. And so instead of dying a slow death, what they want to do, from how I understand it, is to wake the ummah up again to stop the process of normalization, which, if that is true, has been very successful. Because the process of normalization has halted right now. The ability of the Saudis to come out and say we're going to normalize relationships with Israel, they've had to slow that process down, right? That's very important. To the extent that now, after a very, 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 very long time, we're finally hearing dua in these countries being made for Palestinians again. And you've got to understand that imams are not capable, they're not allowed to make these types of dua unless it's state sanctioned, which tells us that they themselves are what? They're trying to control their own population, saying, hey, look, we care, we understand, we care. Just like you care, we care as well. So the khutbahs in these countries are to do with Palestine. Because they're trying to do what? Manage their populations. Their populations are coming out onto the street and they're saying, oh, we've made a mistake here. We've misread the room. What's going on in Palestine is reigniting their passions, and so we have to manage that. So right now we're at a moment where the Palestinians the resistance has allowed that process of normalization to slow down. It's given a voice to the people again. How do we capitalize on that? I really don't know, because that's a much more complicated and difficult question, because each country has its own internal dynamic. Maybe we can bring Sami Hamdi back for that conversation in particular. Mashallah, he is the expert in that area. But the one thing that I genuinely believe in more than anything else is literally people power. I think it's possible with people who have the right hearts, the right intentions, and the willingness to sacrifice, that historically has always brought about change. Like, you study any movement in history, those are the conditions that are required. So it is possible. It just takes a braver heart to do it. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we have a heart that's brave enough to achieve those goals? And then obviously with Allah's tawfiq and His blessings, anything is possible.
Jazakallah khair, Asim, for your time, for coming and talking to us broadly about activism. I think there's some important points that we need to take away. Some of it may seem a little bit abstract, but actually it's the way that we're thinking as believers, and what Asim was saying, which is important. It's all very well going out with your bodies and demonstrating, that's very important, but also it's about a mentality, it's a mindset about how we live in the world, how we respond to injustices around us, and whether there's a feeling in our heart, right? Brothers and sisters, the one thing that people like us who have seen this for years is that as soon as the mainstream media stops reporting on these issues, it will die down. If there's some diplomacy, if something happens, and then the ummah goes quiet. I mean, we're talking about this now. The ummah will go quiet, the Palestinians will be forgotten. People get forgotten until it comes back on the mainstream, right? So let this not be this moment, or any moment, whichever oppressed community is, whatever injustice there is in the world, our heart should be connected with the idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as He says in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that if you do not command the good and you do not forbid the evil, then Allah will put a punishment on us from Himself. We will raise our hands in dua and He will not accept it. Right? So it's important for all of us, for our hearts to be connected with the idea that in any oppression, and Asim, he said he gets the scholars to take out their credit cards. There's lots of oppression in the world, brothers and sisters. It's not just when you see the blood of Muslims being spilled. And we're ordered and we're commanded to try and change that according to our ability and our resources and our time, etc. Right? So please, please bear this in mind. I do want to say two more things, and one is that, just a quick plug, Brother Ahmed Jaddo here runs the Muslim World Telegram group. If you have Telegram, if you don't, please download it and join the Muslim World. I don't know what the address is. TMW underscore media. TMW, the Muslim World, TMW underscore media. You can follow what's going on. Brother Ahmed writes useful summaries so that we don't have to read long articles. It's very beneficial. Please do join up with that. Jazakumullah khair. Jazakumullah khair to all of you for your patience, your time, and for listening. And I hope we can take something forward and be active, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.